Well, yes and no. So a lot has been written about Mina and a lot about Leo through different institutional histories. You've got a history of the Holocaust Museum, we have a history of welfare, we have a history of the National Council of Jewish Women, and we also have some really terrific general expansive histories where they come in and out of these histories all the time. And remember, we've got two separate entries of them in the Australian Dictionary of Biography, one excellent one for Leo and an excellent one written for Mina. So we sometimes find gaps in history that haven't been filled because we have this assumption that they're so well known that it's already been done. And it's only when you start delving in that you sort of realise, well, there's an area here that hasn't really been fulfilled because they worked very much in lockstep with each other. And even when they went in their separate leadership roles, they supported each other. They were there for each other. And even after, Leo passed away in 1972, Mina lived for another 18 years. But she always referred to Leo, and this is what he would do. It was almost as if he was the little ghost on her shoulder, and she would speak about it, about what he would say and he would do. So, yeah, I think there's sometimes an assumption made that everything's been explored because how could it not? And it actually wasn't. So I thought it was timely to write about the two of them together as a couple. Well, a lot, actually, because the research into Yiddish Melbourne gave me a huge amount of groundwork that had already been done, and it gave me a platform, if you like. So it was through my research into Yiddish Melbourne that I actually saw the need to tell Leo and Mina's story. And often in the community now, we walk around, we see a plaque with the name of Leo Fink on it, or a building or a photograph, but we've lost the history that underpins those named endowments or buildings that have been named after them. So when I was researching Yiddish Melbourne, Leo and Mina became real flesh and blood individuals. They weren't anymore just a name or past president of something. They at every critical juncture in the 20th century life of Jewish Melbourne, they were there. I kept bumping into them, whether it was during the Holocaust, in post-war resettlement, during the establishment of the Australian Jewish Welfare Relief Society, or their support for Israel. They were indefatigable workers for Israel, National Council of Jewish Women, and again, the fight for Holocaust memory and the establishment of the Holocaust Museum. So I kept seeing them, and so I did have a lot of background into the sort of, if you like, world that they inhabited. And that was really extremely helpful to me. Well, I think that there was a tremendous synergy between the type of person that Leo was and the type of leader he was and the circumstances which presented themselves. Leo was a very forceful, very dogged, very determined leader, but he was also an extremely democratic and collaborative leader. So he had the ability to bring others along with him, even if they were of a different political persuasion. He was a devout Zionist, and he had in his welfare cohort passionate Bundists who, had different political points of view. So they could, divide and discuss differences of opinion. But the unique situation that confronted the Jewish world, the plight of the Jewish world during the Holocaust and immediately afterwards, confronted all Jews, regardless of their political persuasion, regardless of where they came from, regardless if they were born in Australia of generations, or if they were a recent newcomer, as they were called. So petty differences and political differences could be put aside if the future of the Jewish world was at stake. And Leo was able to see that. And because they understood. I mean, people like Sir Archie Michaelis, who was, you know, a great member of what we call the Jewish establishment, you know, fought in the First World War, lost a brother in the Great War. But he said, you know, we stand shoulder to shoulder with all Jews. We're all in this together, because if Hitler had succeeded, it didn't matter what sort of a Jew you were. It would have been the end of the world Jewry. So I think there was that synergy between the nature of the man, Leo, and Mina. We can't forget that she was a powerful force in the resettlement program. And that force and the type of circumstances that confronted them. Yeah, it is a great question. And let me begin by saying that there are circumstances, and I know researchers who have tried to get into archives, and there's all these caveats that exist over it. You can't do this, you can't look at that. Some of them just refuse completely to cooperate and don't want that. My experience with the Finks was totally different. They gave me absolute, total autonomy over the project from start to finish. There were no caveats. There was nothing. And in fact, people find this quite amazing. And we had the book launch on Monday, and I told people this. Not one member of the Fink family read one word of what I had written until the book was published and they had the book in their hand. Now, I was extremely grateful for the faith that they put into me. And I was respectful, of course, of the trust, the legacy, their precious legacy. Having said that, if I had found something that I thought was explosive or highly contentious, or that the family may have had difficulties with, I wouldn't have hesitated in contacting them. But that didn't happen. They actually made all of their private archives available to me. They gave me unfettered access to everything they had, every photograph, every letter, everything. And the other institutions that I approached, which were Jewish Care, National Council of Jewish Women, the Holocaust Museum, and the University of Melbourne's Fink Papers, all absolutely welcomed me. Just, you know, Jewish Care, I had a desk in the general manager's office, and he just put the boxes on my desk and away I went. And Anna Hirsch, who's the archivist at the Jewish Holocaust Museum, she just called me in. She said, I've got all these archives online. I'm just going to share them all with you. And National Council of Jewish Women, I was brought in. The CEO at the time was Leanne Basser. She just said, Mark, come on in. Here's the cupboard, go for it. So it was, you know, wonderful institutions who really saw the importance of Leo and Mina's story, and all of them said, yes, this has to be done, so go for it. So I was very, very lucky and very fortunate. It's not the case, I understand, with a lot of researchers who are dealing with personal lives and families of those lives. So I was pretty lucky. Well, there's been quite a lot written about, you know, the Jewish Melbourne Australian Jewry in the 1920s and 30s by really, you know, terrific Australian Jewish historians. Leo believed, and Mina, that post-war Jewish immigration had two really important platforms. First one was the imperative to help survivors reconstruct their lives. He was a great believer in empowering people to go ahead and build lives for themselves. He didn't believe that you just gave people endless charity, but, you know, it was about teach a man to fish and you don't have to buy them the fish, you know. And he believed that, first of all, immigration would be a great way of reconstituting a lost world and the people who survived that. Secondly, I think he saw and believed that it would build a more diverse and robust community that was very small and vulnerable. And because I think one of the issues, and it's a big discussion in itself, is that the more freedoms, the more open a society is, the easier it is to assimilate within that society, and the easier it is to marry out in that society. So, I mean, that's a discussion in itself. Some people will say, could argue against that. But in Australia, it was a very free society, and Jewish men tended to marry out more than Jewish women. And that's another discussion point. And unless the women converted to Judaism, Orthodox Judaism is matrilineal. So the children are not considered Jewish. And there was an issue in the 1920s of the rate of out marriages. And that's been documented quite significantly. So I think that this new influx of Jews coming into a very small community, and you've got to remember that even with this huge influx, the Jewish community in Australia has never been more than 0.51% of the total population. So yes, we had a large number of Jews coming in post-war. And so between 1933 and 1961, it kind of tripled the size of the community. But we have to remember that post-war Australian immigration was a very bold plan to build, was a nation-building exercise. Jews were only a very small part of the big picture. But for the Jewish community, I think it was a very important building, if you like, building block for the community, which was potentially vulnerable, and also to reconstruct and give the opportunity to these people, the survivors, to reconstruct a life for themselves. I think up to a point we can draw a parallel, because Leo and Mina's early lives were certainly eventful. And Mina was orphaned at the age of 8 and raised by her maternal grandparents, but neither of them were Holocaust survivors, although they both identified very, very strongly with survivors and the cultural world that had been obliterated, and their connection to that survivor and that survivor world was profound. There's no question about that. And in fact, in one interview, Mina says early on, we all lost someone. And towards the end of Leo's life, in a letter that he wrote to his rabbi very shortly before he died, he remembered and said, the Holocaust shattered me, almost would have broken me, but we couldn't stand by and let nothing be done. So I think they identified very strongly, but they weren't directly impacted by the type of horrific abuse that was experienced by these extremely brave, courageous women. But it is an interesting fact that often the greatest change agents arise from those who are able to have some sort of inner strength and resilience, that they can rise above that adversity and see a greater need to invoke change. And obviously these 3 women fall into that category. And I think Leo and Mina saw the need to invoke change. They identified with it, but they weren't the direct impact in the same way that these kind of experiences, these women had. Well, I have to say, I don't think it's a contradiction. I actually believe it was because she wasn't quite privileged that she was empowered to fight for the causes that were close to her heart. Mina, I mean, it goes back to this old tradition of noblesse oblige. You've heard about the charity that's bestowed by the wealthy on the disadvantaged, let's say. I think that it was because Mina never had to worry about putting food on the table to feed her children. She never had to worry about putting a roof over her head. She could be totally engaged and completely involved in the welfare of others, which she did. So I don't see it as a contradiction to fight for social equality if you live in a comfortable world and if you have a comfortable life. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes it can actually empower you. And I think that was the case with Mina.